Research has shown that alcoholism is a disease with an important genetic component. Like other diseases with genetic influences, such as cancer and heart disease, alcoholism also runs in families. We also know that, despite its negative consequences, alcoholics continue to drink because they find it to be a rewarding experience. Simply put, they drink because in one way or another, it makes them feel better. Due to their genetic makeup, many alcoholics have different brain chemistries, causing them to get more reinforcement from drinking than non-alcoholics. As a result, alcohol allows many alcoholics to get a little higher when celebrating and to feel a little better when drinking to drown their sorrows than a non-alcoholic would under the same circumstances. Because the drinking experience can be so reinforcing, it's become the basis for what scientists have termed the reinforcement model of addiction. But as we all know, feeling better is just one of the effects of alcohol. There are many other less desirable effects. While other drugs of abuse target certain areas of the brain, alcohol's effects are much more wide-reaching, reducing our inhibitions and impairing our judgment, alertness, balance, motor skills, and memory. So how does alcohol make us lose control? And how is it able to take us from an energized state to one where we feel tired and drowsy? The answers to these questions lie deep within the human brain. But before learning how alcohol affects the brain, let's take a look at how our brain functions under normal conditions. At first glance, tennis looks pretty easy. All you have to do is swing a racket and hit the ball over the net. But as easy as it looks, tennis requires a complex set of skills: balance, coordination, concentration, timing, and judgment. All of these skills are possible thanks to the human brain's ability to make millions of split-second decisions, guiding everything we do with remarkable precision. Our brains are made up of many millions of branching cells called neurons. These neurons form an incredibly complex communication network, using a combination of electrical signals and chemical messages to direct all of our physical and mental activities. Although the neurons come very close to one another, they never actually touch. These close areas between neurons are called synapses, and the gap between two neurons is called a synaptic cleft. The neurons communicate with one another by sending chemical messengers across the synaptic cleft. These chemical messengers are called neurotransmitters. Many neurons communicate with hundreds, sometimes thousands of other neurons using synapses to form the brain's equivalent of an information superhighway. In addition to synapses, neurons have three other important components. One of these, the cell body, is the center of the neuron. Its branching arms connect the neuron with its synapses. A second important part, the dendrites, receive the incoming messages sent by other neurons. The dendrites are the arms that relay the messages to the cell body. Third, the arms that relay outgoing messages from the cell body to the synapses are called axons. When a neuron receives a message from a neighboring neuron, it sends a small electrical signal from the synapse down the dendrite to the cell body. When the cell body receives the appropriate signals from its neighboring neurons, it fires or sends a small electrical current down its axon to a synapse. This triggers the release of neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters carry a chemical message across the synaptic cleft to a neighboring neuron. The likelihood that a neuron will fire depends upon the balance of positively and negatively charged particles that they contain. These electrically charged particles are called ions. Neurons containing more positive ions are more likely to fire. Neurons containing more negative ions are less likely to fire. Because different neurotransmitters send different messages, some neurotransmitters increase and others decrease the firing rate of their neighboring neurons. Neurotransmitters that increase firing rates are called excitatory neurotransmitters. Excitatory neurotransmitters let positive ions enter a neuron, making it more likely to fire. Neurotransmitters that decrease or inhibit the firing rates of neighboring neurons are called inhibitory neurotransmitters. Inhibitory neurotransmitters let negative ions enter a neuron, making it less likely to fire. One of the brain's more important inhibitory neurotransmitters is called gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short. GABA controls amazing little electrical gates within the membranes of the neurons. Because these gates regulate the flow of ions into and out of the neuron, we call them ion channels. Ion channels are made from large proteins that are held in place by two layers of fatty molecules called lipids. These two layers of lipids make up the cell membrane and are called the membrane bilayer. As an inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA opens ion channels. This allows negative ions into the neuron, making it less likely to fire. By using a complex system of neurons, neurotransmitters, and ions, the brain is able to control everything we do. For the brain to function properly, neurons must correctly send chemical messages to one another in the form of neurotransmitters. This can only happen if the neurons contain the appropriate balance of positive and negative ions. To successfully achieve a state of mind over body, the brain needs to maintain a chemical balance. But once we add alcohol into the mix, balance quickly gives way to confusion. Now that we've seen how our brains function under normal conditions, let's take a look at the impact of alcohol and how it acts on the brain, creating a world of mixed messages and miscommunication. Regardless of whether it's a favorite beer or a lovely Cabernet, the effects of alcohol are generally the same. Initially, we feel high and energized, but then it's pretty much downhill from there. Disguised as an attractively packaged beverage, alcohol is really a mood-altering drug, sold over the counter without a prescription. A closer look at any alcohol container reveals a government warning label highlighting certain health risks, showing that alcohol is not just a drink, but can also be a dangerous chemical. When we drink alcohol, it travels through the stomach to the digestive tract. From there, the alcohol molecules are quickly absorbed into the bloodstream, and within seconds, they arrive at the brain. The alcohol molecules slip into the neuron's membrane bilayers, making them less stable. Because alcohol has made the membrane unstable, it is less able to hold the proteins that keep the GABA channel firmly in place. With more freedom to move around, the proteins can change their shape or position. This distorts the GABA channels and makes the gates in the channels unable to close properly. Because of this, negative ions can continuously leak through the GABA channel into the neuron. This leakage of negative ions into the neuron makes the neuron less likely to fire, inhibiting not only the brain's ability to process information, but also our ability to function normally. And because alcohol enhances the inhibitory effects of GABA, alcohol is a depressant drug. When you see alcohol's effect on GABA channels, it's easy to understand the connection between neurons transmitting fewer messages and a brain that is slow and out of sync. But what's not as obvious is how GABA influences the initial high we feel when we take our first couple of drinks. To find out more, we'll need to visit the cerebral host of every good time known to us, the reward pathways. Although alcohol reaches all areas of the brain at the same time, we feel some effects earlier than others. One of the first areas where we feel these changes is the limbic system. Located in the center of the brain, the limbic system contains most of the key structures and neurons associated with the reward pathways. Nearly all of our pleasurable experiences, from the thrill of victory to the taste of home cooking to sex, are caused by neurons firing in the reward pathways. These neurons are linked with areas of the brain controlling emotions, decision-making, and memory. To communicate with one another, neurons in the reward pathways use a powerful neurotransmitter called dopamine. When alcohol enters the brain, it causes the neurons in the reward pathways to release dopamine. Dopamine sends a message of well-being along the pathway. We experience this as a feeling of euphoria or high, making us less inhibited while becoming more animated and talkative. So how does GABA, the inhibitory neurotransmitter, cause dopamine to be released? There are a number of possible ways GABA could do this, but we think that one of the most likely ways could be termed inhibiting the inhibitory. Now, if that sounds like a double negative, it's because that's exactly what it is. To explain what we mean by this, we first have to see how the reward pathways work. Neurons within the reward pathways are ready to release dopamine at all times. However, they usually don't because other neurons send them frequent messages telling them not to. As we already know, GABA channels disrupted by alcohol inhibit more and more neurons from firing. As a result, the dopamine neurons start to receive fewer messages telling them not to fire. Eventually, the don't fire messages stop coming, and in the absence of any messages telling them not to, the trigger-happy dopamine neurons release their dopamine more often. So, as you can see, by inhibiting the inhibitor, alcohol causes the release of more dopamine in the reward pathways, resulting in greater feelings of pleasure. Although many of alcohol's effects are caused by interfering with functions of GABA and dopamine, it also interferes with another important neurotransmitter, glutamate. Like GABA, glutamate controls ion channels in the membrane bilayer. But whereas GABA controls the flow of negatively charged ions into the neuron, glutamate controls the flow of positively charged ions. Again, by disrupting the membrane bilayer, alcohol disrupts ion channels, allowing ions to leak into the neuron. This influx of positively charged ions excites the neuron, making it more likely to fire. This is why glutamate is called an excitatory neurotransmitter. In the short term, alcohol's disruption of glutamate channels causes memory problems and impaired decision-making. In the long term, alcohol's interference with glutamate channels appears to be one of the key areas responsible for tolerance and many of the withdrawal symptoms associated with alcoholism. In addition to GABA, dopamine, and glutamate, two other important neurotransmitters, serotonin and the endogenous opiates, are also affected by alcohol. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that helps us regulate our moods and control our emotions. Serotonin plays an important role in many psychological problems such as anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and overeating. The endogenous opiates are naturally occurring morphine-like molecules used by the brain to regulate our responses to both pain and pleasure. Alcohol's direct effect on the functions of both serotonin and endogenous opiates indirectly causes the release of more dopamine within the reward pathways of the brain. The discovery of this process has helped the development of new medications for the treatment of alcoholism. One new medication called naltrexone works by affecting the activities of endogenous opiates. Alcoholics taking naltrexone report a decrease in their desire or cravings for alcohol. And if they do drink, the amount of pleasure they get from the alcohol is reduced because naltrexone indirectly blocks some of the dopamine release caused by the endogenous opiates. We've learned that although alcohol molecules act on most areas of the brain at the same time, we feel some of the effects earlier than others. Both the initial euphoric effect and the later depressant effect are the result of alcohol's effect on several important neurotransmitters, the most critical one being GABA. By increasing the effects of GABA, alcohol impairs the ability of millions of neurons to fire properly, resulting in a brain that's under the influence of alcohol and incapable of normal function. This disruption of GABA channels then affects other key neurotransmitters, including glutamate, dopamine, serotonin, and the endogenous opiates. Understanding these effects has given researchers insight into the relationship between the brain and alcoholism, resulting in new and groundbreaking theories and treatment options. Now that we've seen the basic domino effect of alcohol on the human brain, maybe we need to change some of those inaccurate toasts. Instead of raising our glasses cheering, "Here's to good health," maybe we should say, "Here's to disrupting our neurotransmitters, causing our neurons not to fire properly, and to creating a cerebral chemical imbalance resulting in many physiological and behavioral complications, the least of which being the inability to function normally." Well, it's not quite as catchy, but it's certainly better truth in advertising. Now that we've seen how alcohol disrupts the brain's chemical balance, let's take a look at certain behavioral effects of alcohol and their relationship with specific areas of the brain. The majority of us get the most pleasure from drinking when our blood alcohol levels are going up. As our blood alcohol level starts to drop, we feel less pleasure and may begin to experience unpleasant emotions such as irritability, anger, and depression. Recognizing this, some people try to prolong their feelings of pleasure by attempting to maintain their blood alcohol level near a certain peak point. Since many people judge how drunk they are from how much pleasure they are feeling, it is important to realize that even after our pleasure from drinking has peaked, other areas of the brain continue to become more impaired, impacting our coordination, balance, and judgment. As our blood alcohol level goes up, we think that we are behaving and performing as well as, or even better than we do when we are not drinking. But in reality, our behavior and performance are getting much worse. This large difference in what we think versus what is real can have some serious, wider-reaching consequences that go well beyond a personal desire to drink alcohol. One important brain area affected by alcohol is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus serves as a caretaker for our memory. Individuals who suffer damage to the hippocampus have problems learning and remembering new information. Alcohol's interference with the hippocampus is why we sometimes can't remember what we did when we were drinking. And the more we drink, the less likely it is that we will remember our behavior clearly, if at all. Another area of the brain impacted by alcohol is the locus ceruleus. Located in the stem of the brain, the locus ceruleus controls our ability to track and focus on moving objects. Alcohol disrupts the firing pattern of neurons in the locus ceruleus, causing our eyes to move in jerks. This condition is called nystagmus. Nystagmus makes it difficult for us to focus on an object. Clearly, nystagmus and driving can be a lethal combination, which is why, as part of a field sobriety test, police officers check for nystagmus by shining a flashlight into the eyes of someone they suspect is driving under the influence. Another key area of the brain affected by alcohol is the cerebellum. Located just above the brainstem and spinal cord, the cerebellum controls our motor coordination. Much of the cerebellum is made up of Purkinje cells. These highly specialized nerve cells interconnect to form an elaborate network. Thanks to a well-coordinated signaling process involving thousands of Purkinje cells, we are able to control our muscle movements and balance. As with other cell structures throughout the brain, it's the GABA channels within the membrane bilayer of the Purkinje cells that control the flow of negative ions both in and out of the cell. And as we've already seen, alcohol causes GABA-controlled neurons to become less active, less able to fire, and therefore less able to communicate. This communication breakdown leads to such impaired coordination that we struggle with tasks as simple as walking a straight line. Finally, another important area of the brain affected by alcohol is the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex controls judgment and decision-making. Even at blood alcohol levels of 0.04 or lower, well below the legal limit, the function of the cerebral cortex is affected. Our mood becomes slightly elevated. We start to feel uninhibited, our ability to think clearly is impaired, and our judgment begins to slip. With blood alcohol levels of 0.05 to 0.06, effects on the cerebral cortex become much greater. Our mood is now significantly elevated with little concern over social constraints. Our ability to think clearly is hindered, and our judgment is impaired. This is also the blood alcohol range where we begin to experience problems with coordination and balance. At blood alcohol levels of 0.07 to 0.10, the effects on the cerebral cortex cause our emotions to become exaggerated. At these levels, our ability to think through problems is greatly inhibited. Alcohol now severely disrupts the function of the cerebellum, causing a serious impairment in our coordination and reaction time. We've learned that alcohol disrupts the membrane bilayers of cells throughout the brain, which in turn interferes with the normal activities of several important neurotransmitters, including GABA, glutamate, dopamine, serotonin, and endogenous opiates. Interference with these neurotransmitters changes the chemistry of brain areas, such as the reward pathways, the hippocampus, the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex. These brain areas control a wide range of feelings and behaviors, including pleasure, memory, balance, coordination, and decision-making. We've seen that alcohol is a powerful drug because it acts on so many areas of the brain. But it is also powerful because of the confusion it creates. It spurs our sense of well-being and confidence while systematically eliminating our ability to follow through. While we know that people drink alcohol because it feels good, they do not drink for its other effects such as memory loss and impaired coordination. But recognizing the fact that we can't have one without the others, we begin to see the true power of alcohol, a drug that is so rewarding that it's in constant demand despite its negative consequences.